Edrick Stowe had buried his wife Marisa on a clear, cold morning in the second week of the lean spring of his 59th year, in the small graveyard at the edge of the village of Aspen Run, in a plot they had bought together 19 years before, when their daughter Kell had been a small girl and Marisa had insisted, in her quiet, practical way, that the two plots be bought at the same time, because she had wanted to know, in some small, careful way, she had never fully explained to him, that the place she was going to be put when the time came was a place he would also be put when his time came, and that the two of them would not be in two different small clearings, in two different small valleys. He had not understood at the time the size of what she had been asking for. He had understood on the cold spring morning he had laid her in the plot she had bought herself 19 years before, that her insisting had been, in the slow, careful arithmetic of a long marriage, the most generous thing she had ever done for him, because the knowing of where he was going to be put when the time came had become, over those 19 years, a thing he had not had to think about. And the not having to think about it had been the kind of small, careful gift a long married person sometimes gives another long married person without knowing they are giving it. Because the gift is the kind that only becomes a gift on a morning the giver is no longer present to see it. He had been 59 that spring. He had been a small farmer at the edge of Aspen Run for 31 of those years, on a small 40-acre holding 2 miles east of the village, on the wagon road to the upper country, with a low one-room weathered timber cabin, and a small stone barn, and a kitchen garden, and 4 old apple trees at the south side of the cabin, and 12 sheep and 1 slow, patient, brown and white milk cow named Bridie, and a small flock of red-brown laying hens, and a small dry stone wall along the south fence line that Edrick had built with his own hands across the second and third summers of his marriage to Marisa. He had walked back from the graveyard the morning of the burial in the cold, pale spring sun, alone, the small, careful walk of a man whose body had been doing for 41 years, the small, careful walk of going home to the same other person at the end of every day. He had reached the cabin. He had opened the front door. He had stood at the door for a long count, with the cold spring air at his back, and had looked into the small kitchen at the worn pine kitchen table and the iron cooking stove and the small dry sink and the 2 wooden chairs on either side of the table. And he had understood, in the slow, careful way, he had understood most things across his 59 years, that he had not, in fact, walked back to the cabin. He had walked back to a building that had been a cabin for 41 years and would now be something else. And the something else did not have a name yet. And the not having a name yet was, he understood, the actual condition of being a widower, and not the part with the burial. He had sat in the kitchen chair beside the iron stove all of that day. He had not lit the stove. He had not eaten. He had not done the evening milking of Bridie, who had walked up to the gate of the small barn at the usual hour and had stood there for a long count, and had then, when Edrick had not come, walked back to her place beside the barn, and had lowed once, and had laid down. And Edrick had heard her low through the open back window, and had understood that he had failed Bridie for the first time in 9 years, and that the failing had been the kind of failing he had not yet learned how to carry. He had gotten up at full dark and had walked out to the barn and had milked her slowly by the light of a small brass oil lantern, with his eyes closed for most of the work, because his hands did not need to see. And Bridie had stood patient through the milking, and had not lowed again. And Edrick had thought, kneeling on the small wooden milking stool in the dark barn with his cheek pressed against Bridie's warm flank, that the cow had been the first creature on the property who had known what to do at the end of the day, and that he was going to have to learn from her. Their daughter Kell had stayed 3 weeks. She had come up from the small market town of Brunsdale, 3 valleys south, the day before her mother had died, having ridden hard for 2 days on a borrowed mare to make it in time. And she had been with her mother at the kitchen table at the end, and had held Marisa's hand for the last hour, and had been the one to close her eyes. And she had stayed with her father for the 3 weeks after the burial, and had cooked his small meals, and had done the small, careful work of clearing through Marisa's clothes that Marisa had asked her on the last evening to do, because Marisa had said, in her quiet, practical voice, that the going through of a person's clothes was not the kind of thing a man should be made to do for his wife, and that Kell would know which of the things to keep for herself and which of the things to give to the women of the village, who would be glad of them, and which of the things to fold carefully in the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. And Kell had done all of those things in the 3 weeks after the burial. She had also, in the 3rd week, sat with her father at the kitchen table on a cold spring evening, with 2 cups of weak tea between them, and she had said, in the careful, quiet voice of a daughter who had been thinking about how to say a thing for the whole of the 3 weeks, "Father, I would like you to come down to Brunsdale and live with us." And Edrick Stowe had thought about it carefully and had said in his own quiet voice, "Kell, I would like to come down to Brunsdale and live with you for the rest of my life, and I will not. Because if I come down to Brunsdale now, I will be a man who has been moved by his daughter from the place he has been living for 41 years, and the moving will be a kindness, and the moving will also be a small, careful ending of a piece of me that is not yet ready to end. Kell, give me a year. Let me see whether the cabin and the small farm are going to be a thing I can keep or a thing I cannot keep. At the end of the year, I will come to Brunsdale if I cannot keep it, or I will stay here if I can. I have spent the past 3 weeks watching you do for me what your mother used to do for me, and I have understood in those 3 weeks that you have your own family and your own husband and your own 2 children, and the doing for me is a thing you can carry for 3 weeks, but not for the rest of my life without becoming a smaller person than you should be. And I will not let that happen to my daughter for the sake of my own loneliness." Kell had been quiet for a long count. She had said, in her quiet voice back, "Father, you are the most patient, stubborn man I have ever known." He had said, "I am your mother's husband. I learned it from her." Kell had laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. She had said, "All right, Father, 1 year. I will come up the road every fortnight on the post rider's wagon to bring you a piece of bread and to sit at the kitchen table with you for an hour." They had drunk the tea. She had gone back to Brunsdale on the post rider's wagon the next morning. He had stood at the cabin door and had watched the wagon go up the road in the cold spring sun, and his daughter had turned in the seat and had lifted her hand once to him, and he had lifted his hand once in return, and the bend in the road by the dry pines had taken the wagon, and Edrick Stowe had walked back into his cabin for the first time as the only person who lived in it. The lean spring had passed. The early summer had come. He had done the work. He had done the work the way Bridie had done the work, slowly, patiently, knowing what to do at the end of each day because his hands knew, and not pressing himself to feel anything in particular about the doing. Because the feeling was not he was beginning to understand the kind of thing a person could press into the doing. The feeling was a thing that came when it came, and that left when it left, and that was not on a schedule the doing could keep. He milked Bridie twice a day. He fed the hens. He moved the sheep from the upper pasture to the lower pasture and back again across the early summer. He turned the kitchen garden and planted what Marisa had been going to plant in the spring she had not made it to. He fixed the small worn lashing on the handle of the kindling axe. He tightened the third stone in the small dry stone wall along the south fence line, where the frost had pushed it slightly out of true. He did each small, careful thing the way Marisa had taught him to do each small, careful thing across 41 years of marriage. And he understood, by the second month of the doing, that the small, careful things he had thought he had been doing alone for 41 years had in fact been done with her. In the small, careful sense that the doing of them had been a thing the two of them had been doing in two different parts of the property at the same time, and that the togetherness had been the part of the doing that had made the doing the thing it had been, and that the doing now was the same physical motion of the same hands, on the same tools, in the same places, at the same hours, of the same days, but that it was, in the small, careful sense, a different doing, and that the different doing was the actual shape of being a widower, and not the kitchen chair, and not the empty bed, and not the cold stove in the morning. The midsummer had come. The late summer had come. The early autumn had come. Edrick Stowe had managed. He had not done well, but he had managed. He had eaten the small meals he had taught himself to make in the second month of his widowhood, which were the 4 or 5 small meals Marisa had taught him to make in the first months of their marriage, and which he had not made for himself for 41 years because she had made them for him after that. And he had eaten them slowly at the kitchen table in his usual chair. And he had not sat in her chair, and he had not moved her chair to the wall, and he had simply left her chair where it had been across from his chair across the kitchen table for 41 years. And the chair had stayed there, and he had been able to eat his small meals at his end of the table without the chair on her side becoming a thing that was always weeping at him. Because the chair was not weeping. The chair was just a chair. And the chair, not weeping, had been one of the small, careful arrangements he had been making with the cabin across the summer. The York widow had come up the wagon road on a clear, cool morning in the second week of the early autumn of his 59th year. He had been at the south fence line tightening another stone that the late summer rains had pushed out of true, and he had heard the small, soft sound of a single pair of leather boots coming up the packed dirt of the wagon road, and he had looked up over the stone he was setting. And he had seen, walking slowly up the road from the south, a single adult female orc figure. She was perhaps 45 years old, slim of build and tall, with bright, vivid green skin, the color of new leaves on a summer apple tree, and long, dark hair worn loose to her shoulders and falling unbound in the way the hair of a woman who has stopped pinning it up sometimes falls, and a faded green tribal tattoo in a delicate, angular pattern of small, linked spirals running along her left cheekbone, and large, prominent, pointed, elf-like ears, and small, subtle lower tusks, and dark eyes that were tired in a way Edrick understood without having to think about it, because he had been seeing the same kind of tired in the small mirror above the dry sink in his own kitchen every morning for the past 6 months. She was wearing a long-sleeved, ankle-length, dark slate gray wool dress with a worn, dark leather belt at the waist, woolen leggings underneath, worn brown leather boots on her green feet, a knitted dark forest green wool shawl pulled across her shoulders against the cool morning, fully clothed. She carried in her right green hand a long carved wooden walking stick, and on her back a small worn canvas pack with leather straps. And on the upper strap of the pack, visible to him from the fence line as she walked, was tied with a small leather thong a piece of carved wood, shaped like a small smooth oval, polished by long handling, the size of a hand's palm, and Edrick Stowe, who had been 41 years a married man and had watched Marisa across the kitchen table at every supper of those years, and knew the small, careful things a woman wore on her person and the small, careful reasons she wore them. Knew without having to be told that the small oval of polished carved wood tied to the upper strap of the pack was a widow's mourning token of her people. She walked past the foot of the path that led up to his gate. She did not slow. She did not look up at him. She had the small, careful walk of a woman who had been walking a long road for a long count of days, and had stopped expecting any of the gates along the road to open for her. Edrick Stowe stood up from the stone he had been setting. He laid the small iron mallet on the wall. He walked the 11 paces from the south fence line to the gate at the foot of the path. He stood at the gate. He waited for her to reach the foot of the path. He said in his quiet voice, in the public language, "Good morning." The York widow stopped. She turned her face slowly toward him. She looked at him for a long count, without speaking. She said, in a low, careful voice in the public language, "Good morning." He had not, in the moment he had walked to the gate, planned what he was going to say next, and he understood now, standing at the gate with a stranger Orc widow on the road in front of him, that he had walked to the gate not because he had been planning to say anything in particular, but because he had recognized the small carved oval of polished wood on her pack and had not been able to keep working on the stone after he had seen it. He said, in his quiet voice, "May I ask you, are you walking somewhere in particular today?" The Orc widow thought about it for a count. She said, "My sister's holding is 4 days further up the road, in the upper country, at the foot of the second pass. I am walking there." He said, "You have been walking for some days." She said, 11. He said, "Will you come up to my cabin and sit for an hour? I have a stove that is lit and a kettle that is on, and a small piece of bread, and some dried apple, and some weak black tea." "I will not press you. I have no other reason to ask except that you have been walking 11 days, and there is no other house on this road for the next 9 miles, and the next 4 hours of your walking will not be made easier by the not stopping." The Orc widow looked at him for a very long count. She said, in her low, careful voice, "What is the small oval of wood on the back of your right hand?" Edrick Stowe lifted his right hand and looked at the back of it, and he understood that he had not, in his 31 years of working the small dry stone wall, gotten a single scar that looked like a small oval of wood, and that the Orc widow had not been asking him about a literal mark, and that she had been asking him about the small ring of pale skin on the third finger of his right hand, where a wedding band had been worn for 41 years and removed 3 weeks before because the band had begun to feel heavy. In a way, it had not felt heavy across the first 40 years and 3 months. He said in his quiet voice, "My wife." He said, "I buried her in the lean spring." He said, "6 months ago this week." The York widow looked at him. She said, "Yes." She said, "I would be glad of an hour at your kitchen table, mister." She paused for the small, careful pause of a woman who had been raised in the small, careful courtesies of her clan and would not use a stranger's first name without the proper introduction. "Your name?" He said, "Edrick Stowe." She said, "My name is Yorra of the Hollowstand clan." He said, "Please, come up." They had walked up the path to the cabin together, slowly. She had laid her walking stick by the front door. She had not removed the small canvas pack from her back. She had stood in the small kitchen for a count, while Edrick had set the kettle back on the stove to bring it to the boil and had laid out 2 chipped gray tin cups and the small piece of dark bread on a tin plate and the small dish of dried apple, and had pulled the second wooden chair out from the table for her, the chair that had been Marisa's chair on the far side of the table across from his own. The York widow had looked at the chair. She had said in her low, careful voice, "Mr. Stowe, whose chair is this?" He had thought about it for a count. He had said in his quiet voice, "It was my wife's chair. It has been my wife's chair for 41 years. The York widow had said, "Would you rather I sit at the small wooden stool by the dry sink?" He had thought about that for a longer count. He had said, "No, I would rather you sit in the chair." He had said in his quiet voice, "The chair has been a chair for the past 6 months. It has stopped being only my wife's chair. It is now a chair on the side of the kitchen table where another person sits. It would be a help to me if a person sat in it. I think it would be a help to the chair, too." The York widow had looked at him for a count. She had said in her low, careful voice, "All right." She had sat down. She had taken the canvas pack off her back, slowly, and had laid it on the floor beside her chair, the small carved oval of polished wood tied to the upper strap still visible. She had not removed the dark forest green wool shawl from her shoulders. He had poured the tea. They had sat at the kitchen table on the cool autumn morning, with 2 chipped gray tin cups of weak black tea between them, and the small piece of dark bread, and the small dish of dried apple. And Edrick Stowe had not asked her any question, because he had understood in the small, careful walk from the gate to the cabin that the York widow had been a person who had been asked too many questions across the 11 days of walking, and would prefer, on this morning, to be at a kitchen table where a person did not ask her any. Yorra of the Hollowstand clan had drunk the tea slowly. She had eaten a small piece of the bread. She had not touched the dried apple. She had sat in Marisa's chair for the length of perhaps 15 minutes without speaking. And Edrick had sat in his own chair across from her, and the silence had not been an awkward silence, and had not been a heavy silence, and had not been any other kind of silence Edrick Stowe had imagined he would be sitting in with a stranger orc widow in his own kitchen. It had been the silence of 2 people who had buried someone and were sitting at the same kitchen table for an hour. After the 15 minutes, she had said in her low, careful voice, "My husband, Tervek of the Hollowstand clan, died in the early spring of this year of an old heart that had quietly stopped at the workbench he had been turning wood at for 31 years. He had said in his quiet voice, 'I am sorry.' She had said, 'My wife.' and she had paused at the small, careful pause of having begun a sentence. In the small, careful way she had begun the previous one, and having had to adjust the wording, "Your wife, Mr. Stowe. What did she die of?" He had said, "Of a slow fever that had taken her across the last 6 months of the previous winter." She had said, "Was it a hard thing to watch?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "With my Turvik, it was very quick." He had said, "That is a different kind of hard." She had said, "Yes." He had said in his quiet voice, "Yorra, of the Hollowstand clan, you do not have to tell me anything more than you wish to. I have not asked." She had said, in her low, careful voice back, "Mr. Stowe, I have not told another person about my Turvik in 7 months, because I have been on the road for 11 days, and before the road, I was in my own kitchen with my own cold stove, and there was no one to tell. I am glad to be told to." He had nodded. They had talked for the next 2 hours. They had talked first about Turvik and about Marisa, in the slow, careful way. Two widows who have been alone for many months talk about the dead, not the dramatic things, but the small, careful things that the dead person had been doing in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the year before the death, the small, careful order in which they had liked the kindling laid in the stove, the small, careful word they had used for the cat or the dog or the chicken or the cow. They had talked about Turvik's workbench and the small, careful chisels that were now sitting in the small, careful row on the back wall of the workbench in the holding 2 valleys south, where Yorra had been living alone for 7 months. They had talked about the small, dry stone wall on the south fence line that Edrick had built in the 2nd and 3rd summers of his marriage, and that Marisa had brought him a cup of cool water from the well every afternoon of those 2 summers without being asked. They had talked about Bridie the milk cow, who had walked up to the barn gate the evening of the burial and had stood there waiting to be milked at the usual hour. Yorra had said, "The cow knew." Edrick had said, "The cow knew." After the 2 hours, Yorra had stood up. She had said in her low, careful voice, "Mr. Stowe, I have 4 more days to walk to my sister's holding." He had said, "Yorra, my daughter Kell comes up the road every other Wednesday on the post rider's wagon. The road my daughter takes from Brunsdale to Aspen Run runs past your holding 2 valleys south. I do not know whether you live alone or whether you live with people in your holding, and I do not know whether you will be staying with your sister long. But I would like to give you my daughter's address in Brunsdale and the day she comes up the road. And if you are ever traveling that road and would like to send a small note to her about an hour at a kitchen table, she will carry it up to me on the wagon." She had thought about it. She had said, in her low, careful voice, "I would like that, Mr. Stowe." He had written down the address on a small, folded square of paper. He had handed it to her. She had laid one green hand briefly on his weathered, tanned forearm in the careful, small gesture of acknowledgment her clan used. She had said, "Thank you for the hour at your kitchen table." He had said, "You are welcome." She had picked up her pack and her walking stick and had walked back down the path to the road, and Edrick Stowe had stood at the gate and had watched her walk up the road in the cool autumn sun until she was a single small green and gray figure at the bend by the dry pines. And at the bend she had not looked back, and the dry pines had taken her. He had gone back to the south fence line and had finished setting the stone. He had milked Bridie. He had eaten his small dinner. He had sat at the kitchen table in his usual chair, and Marisa's chair had been on the other side of the table where it had been for 41 years, and the chair had been a chair, and the chair had been a chair on the side of the table where another person sat sometimes now. And the not being only Marisa's chair had been a small, careful gift the York widow had given him by sitting in it for 2 hours on a cool autumn morning, and he had not known that he had been waiting 6 months for the gift, and the not knowing had been replaced, that evening, with a small, careful knowing. The first letter from Yorra had come up the wagon road on the post rider's wagon 4 weeks later. It had been written in clean, careful handwriting on a single sheet of pale, cream-colored paper, and it had said, in 3 short paragraphs, that Yorra had reached her sister's holding at the foot of the second pass 8 days after she had left Edrick's gate, that her sister had not been well and had asked Yorra to stay with her through the deep winter, and that Yorra had agreed to do so, and that she had been thinking, across the 8 days of walking and the first weeks at her sister's, about the small, careful kitchen table at Edrick Stowe's cabin where 2 widows had sat for 2 hours, and that she had not known until she had thought about it that the 2 hours had been the first time in 7 months she had felt like a person and not like a wound, and that she would like, if Edrick Stowe was willing, to write to him through the deep winter from her sister's holding via Kell's wagon, and that she would be glad to receive his letters in return. Edrick Stowe had read the letter at the kitchen table that evening. He had folded it carefully and laid it on the worn pine of the kitchen table at his elbow. He had sat for a long count. He had said aloud, in the small private voice he had begun to use in the cabin, alone in the past 6 months, "Well." He had then taken out his small writing desk and a clean sheet of paper and the small bottle of ink he had not used in many months, and he had written the first letter of what would become, across the next 11 years of his life, the small, careful correspondence between his cabin 2 miles east of Aspen Run and the holdings of the Hollowstand clan, 2 valleys south, and then at the foot of the second pass, and then back at the original holding. He had told Yorra, in his clean, careful handwriting, that the 2 hours had been the first time in 6 months he had eaten his small meal at the kitchen table, with the chair on the other side of the table, being a chair on the side of the table where a person sat instead of a chair that had been Marisa's, and that he had not understood how heavy the chair had been until it had stopped being heavy for 2 hours, and that he had been thinking, since she had walked back up the road, that the chair was going to stay unheavy now, even on the days no person was sitting in it, because the chair had remembered how to be a chair, and that the remembering had been her doing. He had said, "Yorra, I would be glad to write to you through the deep winter and the early spring and the late spring and the easier seasons, and to receive your letters in return, and I will not press you for any larger thing than the letters, because the letters are their own thing, and the 2 hours at the kitchen table were their own thing, and the 2 things together are already more than I had been expecting to find on a road I had been walking alone since the spring." He had folded the letter and had sealed it, and had addressed it to Yorra of the Hollowstand clan in care of her sister's holding at the foot of the second pass, and he had given it to his daughter Kell on the following Wednesday, when she had come up the road on the post rider's wagon, and Kell had carried it back down the road to Brunsdale, and had given it to the trading post keeper at Brunsdale, who had sent it up the upper road to the Hollowstand clan, and Yorra had received it 11 days later, and the small, careful correspondence had begun. They had written for the 11 years, Yorra had come back through Edrick's Road on her way home from her sister's at the end of that first deep winter, and she had stopped at his gate, and she had sat in Marisa's chair for the length of an afternoon, and Edrick had served her tea and a small piece of dark bread and dried apple, and a piece of soft cheese he had bought from the village dairyman for the occasion. She had come back again the following autumn on her way to her sister's, and she had sat in the chair again. She had come back again the following spring. The visits had become, across the second year, a thing the two of them had begun to plan in their letters. By the third year, Yorra had begun to come up the road twice a year and stay 2 days each time, sleeping in the back room of the cabin that had been Kell's room as a girl. By the 5th year, Edrick had begun to walk down to the Hollowstand, holding 2 valleys south, once a year, in the easier season, taking the post-rider's wagon to Brunsdale, and walking the rest to spend a week with Yorra and her sister's grown children. By the 7th year, Kell had taken to calling Yorra in her letters the small, careful name of the York widow of the southern valleys, and Yorra had taken to signing her letters with a small, careful, drawn line under her name in the way her clan used. They had never married. They had not been the kind of people who would have. The first marriage of each had been the marriage, and the second arrangement had been the small, careful arrangement of 2 people who had been widowed and who had found each other on a road and at a kitchen table and in a small, careful correspondence. And the small, careful arrangement had been its own thing and had not needed any other word for it. Edrick had died in his 70th year, in his bed in the small cabin 2 miles east of Aspen Run, of an old heart that had quietly stopped at the end of a long autumn evening. Kell had been there. The post rider had carried the news down the wagon road, and the trading post keeper at Brunsdale had carried it up the upper road, and Yorra had received the letter at her holding in the early winter, and had walked the 8 days down to Aspen Run in the deep snow with her walking stick and her small canvas pack and the small oval of polished carved mourning wood still tied to the upper strap of the pack. And she had reached the cabin on the morning of the 3rd week after Edrick's burial. Kell had let her in. The 2 of them had walked together to the small graveyard at the edge of Aspen Run, and Yorra had stood at the foot of Edrick's grave beside Kell, and she had not said anything for a long count. And then she had laid one green hand briefly on Kell's forearm in the same careful, small gesture her clan used, and Kell had laid her own hand briefly on Yorra's green hand. And the 2 of them had stood at the graveside for a long time. Yorra had stayed 3 days at the cabin. She had sat in Marisa's chair on the second evening with a cup of weak black tea between her hands at the kitchen table, and Kell had sat in Edrick's chair across from her. And the chair on each side of the table had been a chair, and the chairs had not been weeping at either of them, because the chairs had been the chairs of 2 people who had been not alone in their last years. And the not alone had stayed, even when the people who had been not alone were no longer at the chairs themselves. Yorra had walked back up the road on the morning of the 4th day. She had stopped at the gate. She had turned to Kell on the porch and had said, in her low, careful voice, "Kell." He had been my hour at the kitchen table. He had been my 11 years of letters. He had been my small, careful arrangement after Turvik, and I had been his after Marisa. And you and your children had been part of the arrangement, and you will keep being part of it, because the arrangement does not end when one of the 2 of us walks back up the road for the last time. He kept the letters. They are in the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. The chest is yours. The letters of him are mine at the holding, and they are my eldest niece's after I am gone. Because I have told her about your father, and she will know what they are. The arrangement keeps. That is what I came to tell you." Kell had not been able to speak for a count. She had nodded. Yorra had walked up the road. She had not looked back. The dry pines at the bend had taken her, and Kell had stood at the gate for a long time. And she had gone inside, and she had opened the small wooden chest at the foot of her father's bed, and she had read the letters, and she had read them every winter of the rest of her life. He had buried his wife in the spring. An orc widow had walked up the road in the autumn. That was the beginning. That was everything. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Greenbound.